In the winter of 1987, 4 Carmelite nuns disappeared without a trace from a remote convent in the mountains of northern Vermont. For 36 years, their fate remained one of the most baffling mysteries in American religious history. But when a construction crew began renovating the abandoned monastery in 2023, they discovered something beneath the chapel floor that would finally reveal the horrifying truth about what happened during those final days of December, so long ago. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and true crime stories that delve into the darkest corners of human nature, subscribe now and join us as we uncover the chilling secrets buried beneath St. Catherine's. The wind howled through the pines surrounding St. Catherine's Monastery, carrying with it the promise of heavy snow. Sister Mary Therese stood at the window of her small cell, watching the gray sky darken as afternoon faded into early evening. December 28th, 1987. In 3 days, a new year would begin, but something in the air felt wrong. It was heavy with an anticipation she couldn't name. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, feeling the chill seep into her bones. 43 years she had lived within these walls, since she was 17 years old, and full of faith that burned like a candle in her chest. That faith remained, but it had changed, tempered by decades of prayer and silence, of routine and contemplation. Behind her, the small wooden crucifix on the wall cast a long shadow in the dimming light. Her rosary beads lay on the narrow bed, worn smooth by countless prayers. Everything in the cell spoke of simplicity, of a life stripped down to its essential elements. A knock at her door broke the silence. Sister Mary Therese turned from the window. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and Mother Superior Catherine stood in the doorway. Even in the shadows, Sister Mary Therese could see the tension in the older woman's face, the way her fingers worried at the cross hanging from her neck. "We need to speak," Mother Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of us. In the chapter room. Now." Sister Mary Therese felt her heart quicken. "What's happened?" Mother Catherine glanced down the hallway, as if checking to ensure they were alone. When she looked back, her eyes held something Sister Mary Therese had never seen there before: fear. "Just come, please, and tell no one what we discussed tonight." Before Sister Mary Therese could respond, Mother Catherine had already turned away, her footsteps echoing softly down the stone corridor. Sister Mary Therese stood motionless for a moment, listening to the wind rattle the window behind her. Then she reached for her rosary, slipping it into her pocket as she followed the Mother Superior into the gathering darkness of the monastery's ancient halls. She did not know that within 48 hours, she and 3 other sisters would vanish completely, leaving behind only questions that would haunt investigators for more than 3 decades. She did not know that the chapter room meeting that night would be the beginning of something that could not be stopped. She did not know that the walls of St. Catherine's held secrets that some would kill to protect. All she knew, as she walked through the cold corridor toward whatever awaited her, was that the wind outside sounded like weeping, and that something fundamental in her world was about to shatter beyond all repair. Detective Sarah Bowen stood in the parking lot of the abandoned St. Catherine's Monastery, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid March air. Snow still clung to the shadows of the massive stone building, and icicles hung like teeth from the chapel's Gothic archways. She had driven 3 hours from Burlington to reach this isolated place, following directions that took her deeper and deeper into the mountains until civilization seemed like a distant memory. The construction foreman, a stocky man named Gerald Pratt, waited for her by the main entrance, his hard hat tucked under one arm. He looked tired, his face drawn with the kind of exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from seeing something that disturbed the soul. "Detective Bowen," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Thanks for coming so quickly." Sarah shook his hand, noting the slight tremor in his grip. "Your call suggested this was urgent. You said you found something beneath the chapel." Gerald nodded, his jaw tightening. "We've been contracted to convert this place into a retreat center, boutique hotel, meditation spaces, that kind of thing. The chapel was going to be the centerpiece. We started pulling up the old stone floor yesterday to install modern heating, and that's when we found it." He turned toward the entrance, and Sarah followed him through the heavy wooden doors. The interior was dim, illuminated only by work lights that cast harsh shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Their footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness as they crossed what had once been the nave, passing rows where pews had stood before being removed decades ago. The chapel itself was smaller than Sarah had expected, but beautiful in its austerity. Narrow windows, their stained glass, long since removed or broken, let in weak daylight that barely penetrated the gloom. The floor had been partially excavated, revealing dark earth beneath the centuries-old stones. Two other workers stood near the excavation site, speaking in low voices. They fell silent as Sarah and Gerald approached, their faces sharing the same haunted expression she'd seen on the foreman's face. "It's there," Gerald said, pointing to a section of exposed ground near what would have been the altar. "We thought at first it might be an old burial crypt. The monastery's been here since the 1700s, so finding graves wouldn't be unusual. But when we started carefully removing the soil," he trailed off, and one of the other workers, a younger man with a scraggly beard, spoke up. "It's not a crypt. It's something else entirely." Sarah moved closer, pulling a flashlight from her jacket pocket. She knelt beside the excavation and directed the beam downward. The earth had been carefully cleared away to reveal what looked like a wooden structure, almost like a large box or chamber, buried approximately 3 feet below the original floor level. But it was what had been carved into the wood that made her breath catch. Symbols, dozens of them, covered every visible surface. They weren't Christian symbols, nothing she recognized from Catholic iconography. Instead, they were strange, angular marks that seemed to writhe in the shifting light, giving the impression of movement, even though they were static. "Have you opened it?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Gerald shook his head firmly. "We stopped the moment we realized what we were looking at. Called the local police, and they said they'd send someone from the state detective unit. That's you." Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "You did the right thing. This is now a crime scene, until we determine otherwise. I'll need everyone to step back and give me room to work." The 3 men retreated to the chapel entrance, their relief at no longer being responsible for the discovery palpable. Sarah pulled out her phone, but there was no signal this deep in the mountains. She would have to use the radio in her car to call for backup and a forensic team. Before leaving the chapel, she took several photographs of the wooden structure and its strange carvings. The camera flash illuminated the symbols in stark detail, and Sarah found herself staring at them longer than she intended. There was something unsettling about their arrangement, a pattern that suggested meaning, even if she couldn't decipher it. She thought about the call she'd received that morning, about this abandoned monastery and the construction crew's discovery. What she hadn't told Gerald was that she knew about St. Catherine's, about the 4 nuns who had vanished in 1987. Every detective in Vermont knew that story. It was one of the state's most enduring unsolved mysteries, a case that had stumped investigators for decades and spawned countless theories, but never any answers. 4 women had simply disappeared from a locked monastery in the middle of winter, leaving behind no signs of struggle, No evidence of forced entry, no indication of where they might have gone or why. The case had gone cold within months, and over the years it had faded into legend, becoming the kind of story people told to unsettle each other on dark nights. Sarah had been 10 years old when it happened. She remembered seeing the news coverage, the aerial shots of police vehicles surrounding the monastery, the interviews with bewildered investigators who admitted they had no leads whatsoever. She remembered her mother watching the television with unusual intensity, her rosary beads moving through her fingers as she whispered prayers for the missing women. Now, standing in the chapel where those nuns had prayed and sung, Sarah felt the weight of those 36 years pressing down on her. Whatever was buried beneath this floor, whatever secrets this wooden chamber held, she suspected it was about to provide answers to questions that had haunted an entire generation. She took one last look at the carved symbols before heading back toward her car to call for backup. The wind had picked up outside, moaning through the empty monastery, like the voice of something long dead, finally finding the breath to speak. The forensic team arrived 3 hours later, just as the afternoon light began to fail. Sarah had spent the intervening time interviewing Gerald Pratt and his crew, taking detailed notes about the excavation process and establishing a timeline of the discovery. She had also walked the perimeter of the monastery, noting the isolation of the location and the single road that led to and from the property. Dr. Ellen Marsh, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, emerged from the van with her team, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was in her early 60s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for methodical thoroughness that had solved more cold cases than any other expert in New England. "Detective Bowen," she greeted, her voice crisp in the cold air. "I understand we have a potentially significant find." Sarah led her and the team into the chapel, where portable generators had been set up to power additional lighting. The work lights cast the space in harsh illumination, eliminating the shadows, but somehow making the carved wooden structure look even more ominous. Dr. Marsh knelt beside the excavation, her experienced eyes scanning the visible portions of the buried chamber. She didn't speak for several minutes, and Sarah knew better than to interrupt her initial assessment. The other forensic technicians began setting up their equipment, cameras, and measurement tools, and evidence collection supplies, arranged with practiced efficiency. Finally, Dr. Marsh looked up at Sarah. "These carvings are highly unusual. They don't match any religious symbology I'm familiar with, and I've studied quite a bit of ecclesiastical archaeology over the years." "Could they be older than the monastery itself?" Sarah asked. "Maybe something from before the building was constructed." "Possible, but I don't think so. The wood appears to be pine, and the cut marks suggest relatively modern tools, 18th or 19th century at the earliest, more likely even more recent." She paused, running a gloved finger carefully along one of the symbols. These were carved with purpose and precision. This wasn't random decoration. This meant something to whoever created it. One of the forensic technicians, a young woman named Amanda Chen, had been photographing the site from multiple angles. She called out from the far side of the excavation, "Dr. Marsh, you should see this." They joined her, and Amanda pointed her flashlight beam at a section of the wooden structure that had been partially revealed. There, barely visible beneath a layer of dirt, was text carved into the wood. Not the strange symbols, but actual words in English. Dr. Marsh carefully brushed away the loose soil, revealing more of the inscription. The letters were crude, as if carved hastily or under stress. As the dirt fell away, Sarah could make out 3 words, "Forgive us, Father." A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Dr. Marsh continued working, revealing more text. Below the first line was a date, December 30th, 1987. "That's 2 days after the nuns disappeared," Sarah said quietly. Dr. Marsh nodded, her expression grave. "We need to open this chamber, carefully and documentedly, but we need to see what's inside." The process took another 2 hours. Every step was photographed and recorded. The forensic team worked with painstaking care, removing the remaining soil and examining the structure from all sides before attempting to open it. What they discovered was that the wooden chamber was actually more like a large coffin, or chest, approximately 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, with a lid that had been sealed with some kind of resin or tar. As the sun set completely, and the chapel became an island of artificial light, in the surrounding darkness, Dr. Marsh and her team finally prepared to open the lid. Sarah stood nearby, her notepad in hand, trying to maintain professional detachment, even as her heart hammered in her chest. "Ready," Dr. Marsh said, positioning herself at one end of the chamber. 2 technicians took positions along the sides. On 3. 1, 2, 3. They lifted together, and the seal broke with a sound like cracking ice. The lid came away slowly, and a smell rose from within that made everyone step back involuntarily. It wasn't the sweet, sick odor of decay that Sarah had expected. Instead, it was earthier, mixed with something chemical and sharp. Dr. Marsh waved her hand to disperse the air, then leaned forward with her flashlight to peer inside. Sarah watched the older woman's face, saw her eyes widen, saw her jaw clench. When Dr. Marsh straightened, her expression was carefully controlled, but Sarah could see the shock beneath the professional mask. "What is it?" Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Dr. Marsh stepped back from the chamber. 4 bodies, female. Based on the clothing and the state of preservation, I'd estimate they've been here approximately 36 years. The chapel seemed to contract around them, the weight of the revelation pressing down, like physical force. Sarah moved forward, steeling herself, and looked into the chamber. 4 women lay within, their bodies arranged with eerie precision, hands folded across their chests. They wore the black and white habits of Carmelite nuns, the fabric stained and deteriorated, but still recognizable. Their faces were partially mummified by the sealed environment, skin drawn tight over bone, features still discernible enough to show that they had been young, perhaps in their 20s or 30s. But it was their positioning that struck Sarah most forcefully. They hadn't been thrown into the chamber haphazardly. They had been laid out with care, almost tenderly, each woman placed parallel to the others, their habits arranged neatly around them. Someone had taken the time to compose them like this, to create this terrible tableau. "There's something else," Dr. Marsh said, her voice strained. She pointed to the interior walls of the chamber. "More carvings, and look at their hands." Sarah leaned closer, directing her flashlight at the nearest body. The woman's hands were indeed folded across her chest, but they weren't simply resting there. They had been bound together with what looked like wire, the metal dark with age and rust. All 4 women had their hands bound in the same way. The interior walls of the chamber bore more of the strange symbols, but here they were accompanied by words, fragmentary phrases, carved in the same hasty manner as the message on the exterior. They would not stop. The voices grew louder. "We had no choice. May God have mercy." "This wasn't a murder," Sarah said slowly, her mind racing through the implications. "Or, at least, not a straightforward one." Dr. Marsh met her eyes. "No. This was something else entirely. Something that happened inside these walls, involving the people who lived here. We need to find out who these women were, and what circumstances led to them being placed in this chamber." Sarah nodded, already pulling out her phone to call the state police headquarters. There was signal now that they'd set up the communications booster for the forensic team. This was no longer a simple missing persons case, if it ever had been. This was a crime scene that had been hidden for more than 3 decades, and the questions it raised were more disturbing than the discovery itself. Who had built this chamber? Who had placed these 4 women inside it? And most troubling of all, what did the cryptic messages mean? What voices had grown louder? What couldn't be stopped? As she waited for the call to connect, Sarah looked around the chapel, at the stone walls that had stood for centuries, at the empty windows where stained glass had once filtered light into colors of divine grace. How many prayers had been said in this space? How many souls had sought comfort here? And what darkness had ultimately consumed it? The wind outside intensified, rattling the loose shutters and moaning through the monastery's abandoned corridors. In the harsh glow of the work lights, the 4 bodies in their wooden tomb seemed almost peaceful, as if they were merely sleeping, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions and uncover the truth about their last days on earth. Sarah knew that truth, when it came, would be anything but peaceful. The monastery's administrative building stood separate from the main structure, a smaller stone building that had once housed the Mother Superior's office, the records room, and quarters for visiting clergy. Sarah entered it the following morning, accompanied by Father Michael Donnelly, a historian from the Diocese of Burlington, who specialized in the history of religious communities in Vermont. Father Donnelly was in his 70s, with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. He moved slowly through the dusty corridors, his cane tapping against the stone floor, but his mind was sharp and his knowledge encyclopedic. He had brought with him several boxes of archived materials related to St. Catherine's, documents that the diocese had preserved after the monastery's closure. The Carmelite order is contemplative, Father Donnelly explained, as they climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. They live in enclosure, meaning they have minimal contact with the outside world. St. Catherine's was particularly strict in its observance. The sisters here rarely left the grounds, and visitors were allowed only in the parlor, separated by a grill. They reached the records room, where Dr. Marsh and her team had set up a temporary command center. The forensic examination of the 4 bodies was ongoing, but preliminary findings had already provided crucial information. All 4 women had died approximately 36 years ago, during the same time period when the nuns had been reported missing. Cause of death was still under investigation, but there were no obvious signs of violence beyond the wire binding their hands. Sarah had spent the previous evening reviewing the original case files from 1987. The investigation had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. On December 28th, Sister Agnes Beaumont, the monastery's extern sister, who had limited contact with the outside world for practical purposes, had gone to the nearby town of Montrose for supplies. When she returned 3 days later, on December 31st, she found the monastery apparently deserted. 4 nuns were missing: Mother Superior Catherine Devereaux, Sister Mary Therese Blanchard, Sister Margaret Kellen, and Sister Joan Hartford. The other 8 nuns who had lived at St. Catherine's were accounted for. They had been at a sister monastery in Massachusetts, attending a special retreat that had been planned months in advance. Sister Agnes had chosen not to attend due to a winter cold. The 4 missing women had remained behind to maintain the monastery, as the rule required that at least one sister always be present in the chapel for perpetual adoration. "What can you tell me about the 4 women who stayed behind?" Sarah asked, pulling out her notebook. Father Donnelly settled into a chair, arranging the boxes of documents before him. Mother Catherine Devereaux was 61 years old in 1987. She had been Mother Superior for nearly 20 years, highly respected, known for her deep prayer life and her wisdom. Sister Mary Therese Blanchard was 60, the oldest member of the community, except for Mother Catherine. She had been at St. Catherine's since 1944, longer than anyone else. Sister Margaret Kellen was 38, relatively young, and served as the sacristan, responsible for the chapel and liturgical preparations. Sister Joan Hartford was the youngest at 29. She was the librarian and archivist. He paused, opening one of the boxes and removing a folder. I brought their personnel files, such as they are. The Carmelites don't keep extensive records about individual sisters. As part of their charism is a certain anonymity and detachment from worldly identity. But there are some documents here. Letters of recommendation from when they entered, correspondence with the diocesan offices, that sort of thing. Sarah took the folder, spreading the contents across the table. Photographs showed 4 women at various stages of their religious lives. Mother Catherine had a serene face, though her eyes held a penetrating intelligence. Sister Mary Therese looked stern, but not unkind, her face lined with age and prayer. Sister Margaret had been pretty, with delicate features that were somehow enhanced rather than hidden by the habit. Sister Joan was scholarly-looking, wearing glasses even in her profession photograph. Were there any concerns about the community in the months or years before the disappearance? Sarah asked. Any conflicts, financial troubles, anything unusual? Father Donnelly shook his head slowly. Nothing that was reported to the diocese. The community was small but stable. Their accounts were in order, and there had been no complaints or requests for intervention. By all appearances, St. Catherine's was exactly what it was meant to be, a place of prayer and contemplation, removed from the troubles of the world. Dr. Marsh entered the room, carrying a laptop. Detective, I have preliminary autopsy results. You're going to want to see this. She set the laptop on the table, opening a file containing photographs and detailed notes. Sarah leaned forward, Father Donnelly discreetly looking away, out of respect for the deceased. All 4 women died of asphyxiation, Dr. Marsh said, her voice clinical but strained, but not from strangulation or any external force. Their lungs show evidence of having been filled with smoke. They died from smoke inhalation. Sarah frowned. Was there a fire at the monastery? The original investigation didn't mention one. There's no evidence of fire damage to the bodies or their clothing, Dr. Marsh continued. No burn and no heat damage. But their lungs are filled with soot and particulate matter consistent with heavy smoke exposure. It's as if they were in a room filled with smoke, but without actual flames. How is that possible? Sarah asked. Dr. Marsh shook her head. I don't know. But there's more. We found traces of a substance in their systems, a plant-based compound that we're still trying to identify. It's not a common poison, nothing that shows up in our standard toxicology databases. I've sent samples to a specialist in Boston who studies historical medicinal and toxic plants. Father Donnelly had gone very still. When Sarah looked at him, his face had paled considerably. Father, she prompted. He cleared his throat. In the medieval period, certain religious communities experimented with what they called spiritual practices that were later condemned by the Church. Some involved the burning of specific herbs to induce visions or heightened states of prayer. These practices were considered dangerous, bordering on the occult, and were strictly forbidden. Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. You think these nuns were involved in something like that? I don't know, Father Donnelly said, his voice troubled. But if they were, if they had somehow obtained knowledge of these old practices and attempted to use them, the results could have been catastrophic. Some of those herbs were not just hallucinogenic, they were toxic in concentrated doses. Dr. Marsh pulled up another file on her laptop. There's something else. The wire binding their hands, we've analyzed it. It's made from an unusual alloy, not common modern wire. And here's the strange part. The wire shows evidence of having been heated to extreme temperatures at some point, hot enough to partially melt it. Yet the skin beneath shows no burns. The wire was heated after death? Sarah asked. That's the only explanation that makes sense. But why? What purpose would that serve? Sarah stood, walking to the window that overlooked the chapel. Through the old glass, she could see the forensic team's vehicles parked outside, their presence a jarring intrusion of modernity into this place of ancient stone and silence. She thought about the messages carved into the chamber. The voices grew louder. We had no choice. We need to search the rest of the monastery, she said, particularly anywhere these 4 women would have spent time. Their cells, the chapter room, the library. If they were involved in something unusual, something that went wrong, there might be evidence. Father Donnelly rose unsteadily, his cane supporting him. I'll help you search. I know the layout of Carmelite monasteries, where things might be hidden. These old buildings often have spaces that aren't obvious, places where items could be concealed. Over the next several hours, they conducted a methodical search of St. Catherine's. The nuns' cells were small and spare, containing little beyond a bed, a desk, and a crucifix. Sister Joan's cell, however, revealed something unexpected. Behind a loose stone in the wall, they found a small wooden box containing a journal. The journal was leather-bound, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah carefully opened it, seeing handwriting that was elegant but showed signs of increasing distress as the entries progressed. The first entry was dated March 15, 1987, 9 months before the disappearance. Mother Catherine has asked us to pray for guidance. The entry read, Sister Mary Therese has been hearing things in the chapel at night. Voices, she says, speaking in a language she doesn't understand. Mother Catherine believes it may be a spiritual attack, but Sister Mary Therese insists the voices are not demonic. She says they are calling to us, asking for help. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. The entries grew more frequent and more agitated as the months progressed. References to voices became more detailed. Sister Mary Therese wasn't the only one hearing them now. All 4 women who had stayed behind mentioned the phenomenon in their prayer notes, which Sister Joan had apparently been compiling. By November, the entries took on a desperate quality. The voices are constant now. They speak of being trapped, of needing release. Mother Catherine has consulted ancient texts from our library, texts that predate the monastery itself, manuscripts that came from the Old World, when the first sisters settled here. She believes she has found a way to help these souls, but the method requires all of us to participate. We have prayed for discernment. We believe this is what we are called to do. The final entry was dated December 29, 1987. The handwriting was barely legible, scratched across the page with obvious haste. We begin tonight. Mother Catherine says the chamber must be prepared. If we succeed, the voices will be freed and will finally know peace. If we fail, may God have mercy on our souls and forgive us our presumption in attempting this work. Sister Mary Therese is afraid, but her faith is strong. We all go forward together, trusting in divine providence. Whatever comes, we accept it as God's will. Sarah closed the journal, her mind reeling. Father Donnelly had read over her shoulder, and his face was ashen. They weren't murdered, he whispered. They did this to themselves. Some kind of ritual, something they believed would free trapped souls. But it went wrong. The smoke, Dr. Marsh said, having joined them in the cell. They must have burned something, those herbs I mentioned, in an enclosed space, maybe the chamber itself. The concentration would have been overwhelming. Sarah looked at the two of them, pieces of a terrible puzzle falling into place. They built that chamber as part of their ritual, the symbols carved into it, the positioning of everything. They went down there willingly, locked themselves in, and whatever they burned killed them. But who sealed the chamber after they died? Dr. Marsh asked. Someone had to place those stones over it. Someone had to hide what happened here. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and somewhere in the monastery's depths, a door banged repeatedly, a rhythmic sound like a heartbeat echoing through empty corridors. Sister Agnes Beaumont lived in a nursing home in Burlington, 3 hours from St. Catherine's. She was 91 years old now, her body frail, but her mind still remarkably sharp. Sarah had called ahead, and the staff had prepared Sister Agnes for the visit, though they warned that discussing the events of 1987 might be distressing for her. Sarah drove through the city in the gray light of early morning, the journal from Sister Joan's cell resting on the passenger seat beside her. She had spent the previous night reading it again and again, trying to understand what the 4 nuns had believed they were doing, what had driven them to such a desperate and ultimately fatal act. The nursing home was a modern facility, bright and clean, nothing like the ancient stones of St. Catherine's. Sister Agnes waited in a common room, both seated in a wheelchair by a window that overlooked a small garden. She wore a simple gray dress rather than a habit, her white hair cut short, her hands folded in her lap, with the stillness that came from decades of contemplative practice. "Detective Bowen," she said, as Sarah approached, her voice surprisingly strong. "They told me you found them. Oh, after all these years, you found my sisters." Sarah sat in the chair across from her, noting the tears that glistened in the old woman's eyes. "Yes, Sister Agnes. We found them in a chamber beneath the chapel. I need to ask you some questions about what happened in December of 1987. Sister Agnes nodded slowly. "I've waited 36 years to tell someone. They wouldn't believe me then. The police, the investigators, they thought I was confused or lying. But I told them the truth, and they couldn't accept it." "What truth?" Sarah asked gently. The old nun looked out the window, her gaze distant. "I returned to St. Catherine's on December 31st, just as the sun was setting. I had been delayed in Montrose because of the snow. When I arrived, the monastery was completely silent. You must understand, Detective, there is always sound in a monastery. The bells for prayer, the sisters moving through their routines, the murmur of voices during recreation. But that evening, there was nothing. Only silence." She paused, her fingers moving unconsciously in the pattern of prayer on invisible rosary beads. "I went to the chapel first. That's where we always went, where we always were. The chapel was empty, but I noticed immediately that the floor had been disturbed. Stones had been moved near the altar, and there was fresh dirt, as if something had been buried there recently." Sarah leaned forward. "Did you investigate?" "I tried to move the stones, but they were too heavy for me. I called out for my sisters, searched every room, every corridor. I found their cells empty, their personal items still in place. The kitchen had food that had been prepared but not eaten. The chapter room showed signs of recent occupancy, chairs arranged in a circle, as if they had held a meeting." "What did you find in the chapter room?" Sarah asked, remembering the cryptic references in Sister Joan's journal. Sister Agnes's hands began to tremble. Books, old books that I had never seen before, spread out on the table. They were written in Latin and other languages I didn't recognize. There were diagrams, symbols, drawings of chambers and rituals. And there was a letter addressed to me in Mother Catherine's handwriting. Sarah's pulse quickened. What did the letter say? It said that they had been called to perform a great work, a work of mercy for souls in torment. It said that if I was reading the letter, it meant they had succeeded and passed beyond this world, or that they had failed and their bodies would need Christian burial. She asked me to forgive them for the deception, for not telling me what they planned. She said I had been kept ignorant to protect me, in case their actions were viewed as sinful. The old nun's voice broke slightly. She asked me to burn the books, to tell no one what they had attempted. She said the world wouldn't understand, that it would be seen as madness or worse. She begged me to protect their memory and to pray for their souls. Did you burn the books? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Sister Agnes shook her head. I couldn't. I was too frightened, too confused. I hid them before the police arrived. I told the investigators that my sisters had simply vanished, which was true in a sense. I didn't tell them about the books or the letter because I didn't think they would believe me, and I wanted to protect Mother Catherine's reputation. Where did you hide them? In the library, in a space behind one of the shelving units. There's a hollow in the wall, a space that Sister Joan showed me once. She said it was where the old abbesses had hidden things during times of trouble, during the wars and persecutions. I put the books there, and I sealed it with mortar, making it look like solid wall. Sarah felt her heart racing. Sister Agnes, those books might explain what happened. They might help us understand what your sisters were trying to do. The old nun looked at her directly, her eyes clear despite her age. They were trying to free souls from purgatory, detective. That's what the books were about. Ancient Catholic practices predating the Council of Trent, methods that the Church later condemned. Mother Catherine believed that certain souls were trapped, unable to move forward, and that these old rituals could release them. The voices they heard, they believed they were the voices of these trapped souls, calling out for help. And the chamber? A symbolic womb, according to the texts, a place of death and rebirth. They believed that by entering it together, by offering their prayers in that sacred space, while the herbs burned, they could create a doorway for the trapped souls to pass through. They believed they would survive the ritual, that the smoke would only induce visions that would allow them to communicate with these souls and guide them to peace. Sarah sat back, processing this information. But something went wrong. The smoke was too concentrated, or the herbs were more toxic than they realized. Sister Agnes nodded. I believe they died quickly, mercifully, but someone sealed that chamber after their deaths. Someone covered it with stones and tried to hide what had happened. That's what I could never understand. Who did that? Who knew what they had done? You're certain you were alone when you returned? Sarah asked. I never saw anyone else, Sister Agnes replied. But the monastery is large, and the light was failing. I was so distressed by finding my sisters missing that I might not have noticed signs of another presence. And I was only there for a few hours before the police arrived. I called them immediately from the extern phone. Sarah stood, looking out the window at the garden, where spring flowers were just beginning to emerge from the winter soil. Sister Agnes, I need to go back to St. Catherine's and find those books. They might be the key to understanding all of this. The old nun reached out, grasping Sarah's hand with surprising strength. Be careful, detective. Whatever my sisters encountered in that chapel, whatever voices they heard, there was a reason the Church condemned those practices. Some doors, once opened, are difficult to close. Sarah drove back to St. Catherine's, through a landscape that seemed to darken as she approached the mountains, though the afternoon sun should have been at its brightest. She arrived at the monastery as clouds gathered overhead, heavy and gray, promising snow, despite the calendar claiming it was spring. Father Donnelly and Dr. Marsh were in the library when Sarah entered, both of them examining the shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The library was one of the most beautiful rooms in the monastery, with vaulted ceilings and tall windows that would have filled the space with light in better weather. Now, it was dim, illuminated by their work lights, and the thousands of books seemed to watch them with the silent judgment of accumulated knowledge. Sister Agnes told me about hidden books, Sarah explained, describing the space behind the shelving units. We need to find that hollow in the wall. They spent the next hour examining the walls, tapping on the stones, looking for any sign of recent mortar work. It was Father Donnelly who finally found it, behind a shelf containing theological texts from the 17th and 18th centuries. The stones in this section sounded hollow when tapped, and there were indeed signs of mortar that was lighter in color than the surrounding material, suggesting it had been applied more recently. Dr. Marsh called in two of her forensic technicians, and they carefully began removing the stones. The work was delicate, requiring precision to avoid damaging whatever might be hidden behind the wall. After nearly 2 hours, they had created an opening large enough to reach through. Sarah pulled on gloves and carefully reached into the space. Her fingers touched leather, old and dry. She pulled out the first book, then another, then several more. In total, there were 7 volumes, ranging in size from small prayer books to massive tomes that required both hands to lift. They spread the books across a large table in the center of the library. The covers were ancient, the leather cracked with age. Several had no visible titles, but one of the largest bore Latin text that Father Donnelly translated as Rituals for the Liberation of Suffering Souls. Opening the books released the smell of old parchment and something else, something acrid and strange. The pages were covered in dense text, some in Latin, some in what looked like medieval French, some in languages that Father Donnelly admitted he couldn't identify. There were diagrams showing chambers and symbols, instructions for preparing herbs and creating sacred spaces. One book in particular caught Sarah's attention. It was smaller than the others, more like a journal, and it was written in English, in a neat, feminine hand. The first page identified it as belonging to Mother Catherine Devereux, dated January 1987. Sarah began to read aloud, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. I have been hearing the voices for 3 months now. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the product of too much solitude and too little sleep. But the voices persist, and they are so clear, so desperate in their plea for help. I have prayed for guidance, asking God to show me if this is a true calling or a deception. She turned the page. Sister Mary Therese now hears them too. We have discussed this only between ourselves, fearing the others would think us mad. But the voices are real as any sound I have ever heard. They speak of being trapped between worlds, unable to move forward or back, suffering in a state that is neither life nor death. They beg for release. Father Donnelly had gone pale, his hand trembling as he turned pages in another book. These rituals were condemned by the Church. In the 14th century, he said, they were considered too dangerous, too likely to cause harm rather than good. The practitioners believed they could create portals between the physical and spiritual worlds, but the results were catastrophic. People died. Communities were destroyed. The texts were supposed to have been destroyed. How did these books end up here? Dr. Marsh asked. Carmelite monasteries were repositories of knowledge, Father Donnelly explained. Texts that were condemned weren't always destroyed. Sometimes they were hidden, preserved for scholarly study, but kept away from general access. These books must have been here for centuries, hidden in this library, until Mother Catherine found them. Sarah continued reading the journal, watching as Catherine's entries grew more detailed and more convinced that she had been chosen for a sacred mission. By October, she had involved the other 3 nuns, teaching them the rituals, preparing them for what she believed would be a great act of mercy. The final entry was dated December 28th, the day before the ritual. We have fasted and prayed for 3 days. The chamber is prepared according to the instructions in the old texts. Tomorrow night, after Compline, we will descend together. Sister Joan has copied the necessary prayers, and Sister Margaret has prepared the herbs. Sister Mary Therese will lead the chant that opens the doorway. I will speak the words of liberation. If we succeed, countless souls will be freed from their torment. If we fail, we trust in God's mercy and in the prayers of those who come after us. A sound echoed through the library, making them all jump. It was a door slamming somewhere in the monastery's depths, the same sound Sarah had heard before. But now, it was followed by something else, a sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Voices, distant and indistinct, rising and falling, in a rhythm that might have been singing or might have been something else entirely. Dr. Marsh moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. The wind, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah gathered up the books, her hands shaking slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. We need to take these somewhere safe. These are evidence, but they're also dangerous. If what Father Donnelly says is true, if these rituals really can open doorways between worlds, then we need to make sure no one else tries to use them. As they packed the books into evidence boxes, the voices grew louder for a moment, clear enough that Sarah could almost make out words. Then they faded, leaving only the wind and the creaking of old stones settling in the cold. Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the monastery grounds in white silence. Sarah looked back at the chapel as they loaded the boxes into her vehicle, thinking about 4 women who had believed so strongly in their mission that they had been willing to die for it. Had they succeeded? Had they freed those trapped souls? Or had they simply died in a cloud of toxic smoke, victims of their own misguided faith? The questions remained unanswered as Sarah drove away from St. Catherine's, the ancient books secured in her trunk, their secrets wrapped in centuries of silence and shadow. The specialist from Boston arrived at the State Police Forensics Laboratory 3 days later. Dr. Marcus Webb was a toxicologist who had spent 40 years studying historical poisons and medicinal plants, particularly those used in religious and occult practices throughout European history. He was a small man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that seemed perpetually skeptical, the look of someone who had seen too many wild theories collapse under scientific scrutiny. Sarah met him in the laboratory where the books from St. Catherine's had been carefully catalogued, and where samples from the bodies and the chamber were being analyzed. Dr. Marsh had already briefed him on the case, but he insisted on examining everything himself before drawing any conclusions. The substance we found in their lung tissue is unusual, Dr. Marsh explained, pulling up microscopic images on her computer screen. It's plant-based, definitely organic material, but we haven't been able to identify it through our standard databases. Dr. Webb leaned forward, studying the images with intense concentration. After several minutes, he straightened and removed his glasses, cleaning them methodically. "May I see the books you recovered?" They led him to a secure room where the 7 volumes had been spread across a long table, each one carefully preserved, under archival conditions. Dr. Webb approached them reverently, his fingers hovering over the covers without actually touching them. "These are extraordinary," he murmured. "I've read about texts like these, but I've never actually seen them. Most were destroyed during the various Inquisitions and Reformations." He carefully opened the largest volume, the one containing the ritual instructions, and began reading. His lips moved silently as he translated the Latin, his expression growing more troubled with each page. After nearly an hour of examination, he looked up at Sarah and Dr. Marsh. "Your nuns were working with a substance called catharsis nigrum, black purge. It's mentioned in several medieval texts as a plant used in rituals designed to induce visions of the afterlife. The plant itself is thought to be extinct, a type of nightshade that grew in specific mountainous regions of Europe." "Thought to be extinct?" Sarah asked. Dr. Webb nodded. "No confirmed specimens have been found in over 200 years. But according to these texts, seeds were sometimes preserved by religious communities who practiced these rituals. The plant was extremely difficult to cultivate, requiring very specific conditions, and it was extraordinarily toxic. Even small amounts of its smoke could cause powerful hallucinations. Larger amounts would cause respiratory failure and death." He turned to another page, pointing to a detailed botanical illustration. "The ritual described here calls for the burning of catharsis nigrum in an enclosed space. The practitioners were supposed to inhale just enough smoke to induce the visionary state, then exit the chamber before the concentration became lethal. But the timing was critical, and there was virtually no margin for error." "They miscalculated," Dr. Marsh said quietly. "Or they intended to die," Dr. Webb replied. "Some of these rituals were explicitly sacrificial. The practitioners believed that by offering their own lives, they could create a more powerful doorway between worlds. Their deaths would provide the energy needed to free the trapped souls." Sarah felt a chill run through her. "You're saying they committed suicide as part of the ritual?" Dr. Webb closed the book carefully. "I'm saying that's one interpretation. Another is that they genuinely believed they would survive, that their faith would protect them. Medieval religious practice often involved a kind of spiritual recklessness, a willingness to risk everything for what they perceived as a greater good. These women may have believed they were protected by divine grace." Father Donnelly, who had been listening silently from the doorway, spoke up. "The wire binding their hands. In some medieval penitential practices, binding the hands was a symbol of submission to God's will, of accepting whatever outcome came from the ritual. They bound themselves as a sign of their complete surrender." "But the wire was heated after death," Dr. Marsh pointed out. "That suggests someone else was involved, someone who came after they died." "Not necessarily," Dr. Webb said. "Some of these rituals called for the sealing of the practitioners' bodies with heated metal to prevent their spirits from escaping before the work was complete. If they had set up the chamber correctly, with some kind of delayed heating mechanism, the wire could have been heated by residual heat from the burning herbs or from candles arranged around the bodies." Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the gray sky. It had been snowing on and off for 3 days, and the world outside seemed locked in winter, despite the calendar insisting it was April. So, they went into that chamber knowing they might die. They burned this plant, inhaled the smoke, and suffocated. Then someone or something sealed the chamber with stones. The question is who? Sister Agnes swears she was alone when she returned. "May I suggest something?" Father Donnelly said, hesitantly. "I've been researching the history of St. Catherine's over the past few days. The monastery was built in 1745, on land that had previously been a Native American sacred site. The local Abenaki people had stories about that location, stories of spirits that were trapped there after a great battle. When the first Carmelite sisters arrived from France, they chose that spot specifically because they believed the ground was sacred, that prayers offered there would be particularly powerful. Sarah turned back to face him. You think the voices the nuns heard were real? That there actually were trapped spirits at that location? Father Donnelly spread his hands. I'm a historian and a priest, detective. I believe in the spiritual realm, but I also believe in evidence and reason. What I can tell you is that there have been unusual reports associated with that location for nearly 300 years. Sisters at St. Catherine's frequently reported hearing things, seeing things, nothing that couldn't be explained as imagination or natural phenomena. But the pattern is consistent. Dr. Webb had returned to examining the books, and now he called out, "There's something else here you should see. Instructions for what happens after the ritual, after the doorway is opened." They gathered around the table as he pointed to a page covered in dense Latin text and a diagram showing a human figure surrounded by symbols. According to this, if the ritual succeeds, if the doorway actually opens, then one of the practitioners must remain behind to close it. The text calls this person the guardian. They stay in the physical world, while the others pass through with the liberated souls, and their job is to seal the doorway so that nothing else can come through. But all 4 women died in the chamber, Sarah said. Yes, Dr. Webb replied, which means either the ritual failed completely and they all died from smoke inhalation, or it succeeded, and the guardian failed to survive long enough to properly close the doorway. A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah thought about the chamber beneath the chapel, about the 4 women lying in their wooden tomb, about the cryptic messages carved into the walls. May God have mercy. We had no choice. I need to go back to St. Catherine's, she said abruptly. There's something we're missing, something we haven't found yet. Dr. Marsh looked concerned. Detective, the site is still under investigation. My team is conducting additional excavations around the chamber, looking for any other evidence. I know, Sarah said, but I need to see it again. Something about this doesn't add up. If one of them was supposed to be the guardian, to stay behind and close the doorway, then why are all 4 bodies in the chamber? And who sealed it with stones afterward? Father Donnelly gathered his coat. I'll come with you. If we're looking for answers, they'll be in the monastery's history, in spaces and objects that only someone familiar with religious life would recognize. They drove through the falling snow. The world outside the car windows reduced to a blur of white. Sarah's mind kept returning to Mother Catherine's journal, to the absolute certainty in her writing that they were doing something good and necessary. How could someone so convinced of their righteous purpose end up dead in a sealed chamber beneath a chapel? St. Catherine's emerged from the snow like a ghost, its stone walls dark against the white landscape. The forensic team's vehicles were still there, but the workers had finished for the day, driven away by the worsening weather. Only a single police officer remained, stationed at the entrance to maintain security. Sarah and Father Donnelly entered the chapel, where the excavation had expanded. Dr. Marsh's team had removed more of the stone floor, revealing the full extent of the chamber. It was larger than they had initially thought, approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with the wooden structure containing the bodies occupying only the central portion. Around the edges of the chamber, carved into the earth itself, were more symbols. These were different from the ones on the wooden structure, older and more primitive. Father Donnelly knelt at the edge of the excavation, studying them with a flashlight. "These aren't Christian," he said. "These are older, much older. Abenaki, possibly, or from some other indigenous tradition. They predate the monastery by centuries, maybe millennia." Sarah climbed down into the excavation carefully, avoiding the wooden structure where the bodies had been found. The earth around the chamber was hard-packed and cold, and in the beam of her flashlight, she could see layers of different soil colors, suggesting that this space had been disturbed and refilled multiple times over the years. Something caught her eye, a slight irregularity in the earth wall at the far end of the chamber. She moved closer, brushing away loose soil with her gloved hand. Beneath the surface layer, she found what looked like another carved symbol, but this one had been deliberately covered over, hidden with packed earth. "Father, look at this," she called. Father Donnelly climbed down to join her, his movements careful on the uneven ground. Together they carefully cleared away more soil, revealing not just one symbol, but an entire panel of carved text and images. The text was in Latin, but the handwriting was different from anything they had seen in the books. This was older, cruder, carved directly into the hardened earth with some kind of tool. Father Donnelly read slowly, translating as he went. "Here lies the passage between worlds, sealed by the Sisters of St. Catherine in the year 1752. May no one open what we have closed. May the dead remain dead, and the living remain living. May God have mercy on us for what we allowed to be buried here." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. 1752. That's only 7 years after the monastery was founded. Something happened here, something that made the original sisters seal this space. They continued excavating, working carefully to preserve any evidence while uncovering more of the hidden text. What emerged was a fragmentary story, carved in desperate haste by someone who knew they might not survive to tell it any other way. The original Carmelite sisters who had settled at St. Catherine's had indeed been drawn to the location because of its spiritual significance. But what they had found there was not holy ground, but a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, a place where the dead could sometimes be heard by the living. The local Abenaki had known this and had avoided the area, considering it cursed. The French sisters, in their zealous piety, had believed they could sanctify the ground through prayer. They had built their monastery and dedicated themselves to constant prayer, thinking their devotion would purify the site. But the voices had persisted, growing stronger rather than weaker. Finally, in 1752, something had happened, something the carved text described only as the opening. 3 sisters died that year. Father Donnelly read, his voice strained. They attempted a ritual to silence the voices forever. They believed they could seal the doorway between worlds, that their prayers and their sacrifice would close it permanently. But they failed. Instead of closing the doorway, they made it wider. Things came through, things that should not have been able to cross over. "What things?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Father Donnelly continued reading. The surviving sisters fought for 3 days to force back what had emerged. They used fire and prayer, and finally their own blood. They sealed the opening with stones and earth, and they carved these warnings so that no future generation would be foolish enough to disturb it. Sarah stood, her legs cramping from kneeling in the cold earth. Mother Catherine and her sisters didn't know about this. They thought they were opening a doorway to help trapped souls, but they were actually breaking a seal that had been placed there over 200 years ago to keep something contained. And when they broke that seal, Father Donnelly said quietly, when they opened that doorway again, whatever had been trapped beneath came through. That's what killed them. Not just the smoke from the herbs, but something else, something that the smoke allowed to manifest. A sound echoed through the chapel, making them both freeze. It was the same voice-like sound Sarah had heard before, but now it was clearer, more distinct. It sounded like chanting, like multiple voices speaking in unison, but the words were in no language Sarah recognized. Father Donnelly's face had gone white. "We need to leave, now. And we need to seal this chamber again, permanently." They climbed out of the excavation. Their movements hurried despite the need for caution. As they crossed the chapel floor, the voices grew louder, and Sarah could feel a pressure in the air, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on them. They burst out of the chapel into the snow, both of them gasping in the cold air. The police officer at the entrance looked startled by their hasty exit. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She and Father Donnelly walked quickly to her car, neither speaking until they were safely inside, with the doors closed. "What do we do?" Sarah asked finally. "We can't just leave it open. If what you're saying is true, if there's actually something down there, something that the original sisters sealed away, then we need to close it again." Father Donnelly's hands trembled as he fastened his seatbelt. "The church has protocols for this sort of thing. Exorcism, purification rites, but this is beyond anything in our standard procedures. This is something older and more dangerous. We need help, Detective. We need someone who understands these ancient practices and knows how to counter them." Sarah started the car, her mind racing. Behind them, St. Catherine's stood silent in the falling snow, its windows dark, its secrets buried but not forgotten. As they drove away, she looked in the rearview mirror and thought she saw movement in one of the chapel windows, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. But when she blinked, it was gone. Dr. Webb had made some calls. Within 24 hours, a woman named Dr. Helena Vasquez arrived at the state police headquarters from New York. She was in her 50s, with dark hair streaked with gray and an intensity in her eyes that suggested someone who had seen things most people wouldn't believe. She introduced herself as an anthropologist, specializing in comparative religious practices, but Sarah quickly realized she was something more than that. They met in a conference room where all the evidence from St. Catherine's had been assembled. The books, photographs of the chamber, copies of the carved texts, soil samples, everything. Dr. Vasquez spent 3 hours examining the materials without speaking, making notes in a leather journal, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. Finally, she set down her pen and looked at Sarah, Father Donnelly, and Dr. Webb. "What you've uncovered is extremely rare and extremely dangerous. The original sisters in 1742 were correct to seal that space. The location has what indigenous cultures call a thin place, where the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds is naturally weak. The Abenaki recognized this and avoided it. The French sisters, in their European arrogance, thought they could control it through Christian prayer. But they couldn't, Sarah said. No. And when they attempted their ritual, when they tried to force the doorway closed, they didn't understand what they were dealing with. They weren't trying to seal out spirits of the dead. They were trying to contain something else, something that had been using the thin place as a crossing point long before humans built anything on that land. Dr. Vasquez pulled out one of the books from St. Catherine's, the one with the ritual instructions. Mother Catherine and her sisters thought they were using a liberation ritual, a Catholic practice for freeing souls from purgatory. But the ritual in this book isn't Catholic, despite its Latin text and Christian symbolism. This is much older. This comes from practices that predate Christianity, practices that early Christian missionaries tried to suppress, but never fully eradicated. What kind of practices? Father Donnelly asked, his voice tight. Soul trafficking, Dr. Vasquez said bluntly. The ritual isn't designed to free trapped souls. It's designed to offer souls as passage for something that wants to cross from one realm to another. The practitioners enter the chamber, induce the visionary state with the smoke, and essentially open themselves as conduits. What they think are trapped souls crying for help are actually predatory entities that feed on life force and consciousness. The room fell silent. Dr. Marsh, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up. Are you seriously suggesting that supernatural entities killed those 4 women? Dr. Vasquez turned to her. I'm suggesting that 4 women performed a ritual they didn't fully understand, using toxic substances in an enclosed space built over a geological and spiritual anomaly. Whether you want to explain what happened to them in terms of neurological effects from hallucinogenic smoke or in terms of actual spiritual predation, the result is the same. They died, and they died in a way that suggests their final moments were terrifying. She pulled out several photographs of the bodies as they had been found in the chamber. Look at their faces. Even with the mummification and decomposition, you can see the expressions. These women died in terror. Whatever they experienced in those final moments, real or hallucinated, it was horrific. Sarah studied the photographs she had avoided looking at too closely before. Dr. Vasquez was right. The women's faces, even after 36 years, showed signs of extreme distress. Their mouths were open, as if in screams, their features contorted. The smoke alone wouldn't cause that reaction, Dr. Webb said quietly. Catharsis nigrum causes respiratory paralysis. Death would be relatively quick once a lethal dose was inhaled. But these expressions suggest they were conscious and aware for longer than that they were experiencing something while they died. Dr. Vasquez nodded. The ritual calls for the practitioners to remain conscious as long as possible, to maintain awareness during the crossing. The smoke induces visions, opens the mind to other perceptions, but it's not meant to be immediately lethal. These women would have been conscious and experiencing whatever the ritual manifested for several minutes before the smoke killed them. And the guardian? Sarah asked. The text said one was supposed to remain behind to close the doorway. The guardian's role is to seal the crossing once the transaction is complete, Dr. Vasquez explained. In a successful ritual, 3 practitioners would pass through with the entities they were supposedly liberating, and the 4th would remain in the physical world to close and seal the doorway. But this ritual didn't succeed in the way the instructions described. All 4 women died in the chamber, which means the doorway was never properly closed. Father Donnelly leaned forward. But someone sealed the chamber with stones. Someone hid what happened. Yes, Dr. Vasquez said. And I think I know who. May I see the journal you found? The one written by Sister Joan? Sarah retrieved it from the evidence box and handed it over. Dr. Vasquez paged through it until she found what she was looking for. Here, Sister Joan mentions that Mother Catherine asked her to copy the necessary prayers for the ritual. She was the scribe, the one who prepared the written materials. In many of these old rituals, the scribe has a special role. They're not actually part of the ritual itself. They document it, but they don't participate. You think Sister Joan wasn't in the chamber when the others died? Sarah asked. I think Sister Joan was supposed to be the guardian, but not in the way the others understood. Look at this entry from December 27th. She read aloud. Mother Catherine has asked me to make a solemn promise. If the ritual fails, if the doorway opens, but cannot be closed, I must seal the chamber by any means necessary. She says it is my duty to protect the world from what might come through, even if it means sealing my sisters inside." The implications hung in the air. Sarah felt sick as understanding dawned. Sister Joan watched them die. She was there, but she stayed outside the chamber. And when the ritual went wrong, when they all died, and the doorway remained open, she did what Mother Catherine had asked. She sealed them inside. The stones would have been prepared in advance, Dr. Vasquez said, arranged nearby, ready to be moved into place. Sister Joan, even as a young woman, would have had the strength to position them if they were already close at hand. It would have taken her hours, working alone in the dark, but she would have done it, because she had promised and because she understood what would happen if she didn't. But she died too, Dr. Marsh pointed out. She was found in her cell, apparently of natural causes, on January 2nd, 1988. The medical examiner at the time determined she had a heart attack. Dr. Vasquez closed the journal carefully. She was 29 years old and healthy. Young nuns don't generally have heart attacks. I think the stress of what she did, the trauma of watching her sisters die and then sealing them in their tomb, was too much. Or perhaps something came through anyway, something that found her after she completed the sealing. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "We need to go back to St. Catherine's and finish what Sister Joan started. We need to properly close that chamber, seal it in a way that ensures nothing can come through." "It's not that simple," Dr. Vasquez said. "The excavation your forensic team conducted has disturbed the seal. By removing the stones, by opening the chamber to document the bodies, you've essentially reopened the doorway. If my analysis is correct, if there really is some kind of anomaly at that location, then it's active again." "The voices," Father Donnelly said. "Detective Bowen and I both heard them when we were in the chapel. That's never happened before, in all the years the site has been abandoned." Dr. Vasquez gathered her materials. "I need to see the location myself. Tonight, if possible. These things are often tied to specific times, to cycles of the moon, or to anniversaries. The original sealing happened in January 1752. The 4 nuns died on December 30th, 1987. We're in early April now, but we shouldn't wait. The longer that chamber remains open, the more dangerous it becomes." Within 2 hours, they had assembled a team and were driving through the darkness toward St. Catherine's. Dr. Vasquez had brought her own equipment: candles, salt, herbs that she said had protective properties, and a small leather bag containing what she described as items of power collected from various spiritual traditions. Father Donnelly had his ritual books and holy water. Dr. Webb had brought samples of plants that might counteract any residual effects of the catharsis nigrum. Sarah had her gun, though she knew it would be useless against whatever they might encounter. They arrived at the monastery shortly before midnight. The moon was nearly full, hanging heavy in a clear sky now that the snow had stopped. Its light turned the monastery's stones silver and cast long shadows across the chapel entrance. The police officer on duty looked relieved to see them. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "It's been strange tonight. Sounds coming from inside, movements I can't explain. I was about to call it in." "You can leave," Sarah told him. "Take the rest of the night off. We'll secure the site." He didn't need to be told twice. Within minutes, his car was disappearing down the mountain road, leaving them alone with the ancient stones and whatever lay beneath them. They entered the chapel together, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The excavation yawned before them, deeper and darker than it had seemed in daylight. Dr. Vasquez moved to the edge and looked down, her face unreadable. "Yes," she said softly. "It's active. I can feel it." Sarah couldn't feel anything except cold and a growing sense of dread, but she trusted Dr. Vasquez's expertise. What do? We perform a closing ritual, not the Christian version, not the indigenous version, but a combination. We use elements from multiple traditions because this anomaly predates any single religious framework. We need to address it in a language it understands, with symbols that carry real power. They spent the next hour preparing. Dr. Vasquez directed them in creating a circle around the excavation using salt and certain herbs. Father Donnelly set up candles at the cardinal points, blessing each one with prayers in Latin. Dr. Webb positioned sensors to measure temperature, electromagnetic fields, and air quality. His scientific mind refusing to abandon evidence collection, even in these circumstances. Sarah stood watch, her flashlight scanning the darkness beyond their circle of candlelight, her hand never far from her weapon. At precisely 1 a.m, Dr. Vasquez began. She spoke in multiple languages, Latin and French, and something that sounded Native American, words flowing together in a complex pattern that seemed to create harmonics in the air. Father Donnelly joined in with Catholic prayers, and surprisingly so did Dr. Webb, chanting something in what sounded like ancient Greek. The temperature in the chapel dropped sharply. Sarah's breath became visible as frost formed on the walls. The candles flickered despite there being no wind, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker, more substantial. Then the voices began. Not the distant, indistinct sounds they had heard before, but clear and close and multiple. They spoke in English and French and other languages, overlapping and urgent and pleading. Sarah heard women's voices, men's voices, children's voices, all crying out for help, for release, for mercy. Dr. Vasquez's chanting grew louder, more forceful. She pulled items from her leather bag, a small mirror which she positioned to reflect the moonlight down into the excavation, a bundle of burning sage, which filled the air with pungent smoke, a stone carved with symbols that predated any written language. The voices grew louder in response, becoming angry, becoming desperate. Sarah felt pressure in her ears, a sense of presence that made her skin crawl. In the candlelight, she thought she saw shapes moving in the excavation, shadows that weren't cast by anything physical. Father Donnelly continued his prayers, his voice shaking but steady. Dr. Webb's instruments were going wild, needles swinging across their scales, digital displays showing readings that shouldn't have been possible. Then Dr. Vasquez shouted something in a language Sarah didn't recognize, a single word that seemed to echo and reverberate far longer than it should have. She threw the carved stone down into the excavation, where it struck the wooden chamber with a sound like thunder. The voices cut off abruptly. The shadows retreated. The temperature began to slowly rise. In the sudden silence, Sarah could hear her own heart pounding, could hear the others breathing heavily from exertion and fear. Dr. Vasquez slumped, catching herself on the edge of the excavation. It's done. The doorway is closed, but we need to seal the chamber permanently tonight, before dawn. If we don't, it will open again. They worked through the remaining hours of darkness, filling in the excavation with earth and stones, following Dr. Vasquez's specific instructions about the placement of certain materials and symbols. Father Donnelly blessed each layer, and Dr. Webb documented everything with scientific precision. As the first light of dawn touched the chapel windows, they placed the final stones, recreating the floor as it had been before the excavation began. Dr. Vasquez carved a final symbol into the stone, a mark that combined elements from multiple traditions, a universal seal that she said would hold as long as the building stood. Exhausted, they gathered their equipment and left the chapel. In the early morning light, St. Catherine's looked peaceful, almost benign. The horrors it had contained, the suffering it had witnessed, were once again hidden beneath stone and earth and silence. As they drove away, Sarah looked back one last time at the monastery. She thought about the 4 nuns who had died there, about Sister Joan, who had survived long enough to seal them in their tomb, about the generations of women who had prayed in that chapel without knowing what lay beneath their feet. The case could now be officially closed. The 4 missing nuns had been found. Their deaths explained as much as they ever would be. The public would be told about the ritual gone wrong, about toxic smoke and religious fervor and tragic miscalculation. But Sarah would always know the truth, or at least as much of it as human understanding could encompass. Some doorways should never be opened, some voices should never be answered, and some places, no matter how sanctified with prayer and sacrifice, remain forever thin places where the boundaries between worlds are dangerous and fragile. The official report was filed 3 weeks later. Detective Sarah Bowen sat in her office at the state police headquarters reviewing the final documentation before it was submitted to the archives. The case of the 4 missing nuns from St. Catherine's Monastery was now solved, at least in the eyes of the law and the public record. The bodies had been identified through dental records and DNA analysis as Mother Superior Catherine Devereaux, Sister Mary Therese Blanchard, Sister Margaret Kellen, and Sister Joan Hartford. The discrepancy about Sister Joan, the fact that she had supposedly been found dead in her cell on January 2, 1988, had been resolved through examination of the original police reports from that time. What Sarah had discovered was that the body found in Sister Joan's cell had never been definitively identified. The assumption had been made that it was Sister Joan because it was found in her cell and was wearing a Carmelite habit, but no formal identification had been conducted. The medical examiner in 1988 had been overwhelmed with a particularly harsh winter that had caused multiple deaths across the region, and in the case of an apparent heart attack in an isolated monastery, corners had been cut. The body in the cell had actually been Sister Agnes Beaumont, the extern sister who had supposedly discovered the disappearance. DNA testing had confirmed it. Sister Agnes, the woman now living in the Burlington nursing home, was not Sister Agnes at all. She was Sister Joan Hartford. Sarah had confronted her 2 weeks ago, returning to the nursing home with the DNA results and a recording device. The old woman, the woman she had known as Sister Agnes, had looked at the evidence with tired eyes and finally nodded. "I wondered when you would figure it out," she had said, her voice resigned. 36 years is a long time to carry a lie. She had told Sarah everything then, the whole terrible truth. Sister Joan had indeed been the one designated to seal the chamber if the ritual failed. She had watched from the chapel, hidden behind a pillar, as her 4 sisters descended into the chamber they had built beneath the floor. She had watched as they lit the brazier containing the Augii Catharsis Nigrum, as the smoke filled the enclosed space, as they began their chant. The voices started immediately, Sister Joan had said, her hands trembling in her lap. "Not from my sisters, but from the chamber itself." Hundreds of voices, thousands maybe, all crying out at once. The smoke grew so thick I couldn't see them anymore, but I could hear them screaming. Not chanting, not praying, screaming. She had waited, following Mother Catherine's instructions, ready to help them exit the chamber when the ritual was complete. But they never emerged. After 30 minutes, the screaming stopped. After an hour, there was only silence and the smell of burned herbs and something worse, something like decay and death and ancient earth. Sister Joan had descended into the excavation, had looked into the chamber through the smoke still lingering there, and had seen all 4 of her sisters lying motionless, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, their hands already bound with the heated wire that had been part of the ritual preparation. "I didn't understand the wire at first," she had told Sarah. "We had placed it in the brazier to heat it, as the instructions specified, but I thought it was meant to be used during the ritual, not after. But when I saw them, I realized the wire had somehow bound their hands on its own, had wrapped around their wrists while they died. It was as if something had wanted to make sure they couldn't escape, couldn't reach out for help." Alone in the chapel, terrified and traumatized, Sister Joan had done what she had promised. She had spent 8 hours moving stones into place, sealing the chamber, making it appear as if the floor had never been disturbed. She had been strong for a 29-year-old woman, strengthened by fear and determination, and the certainty that if she didn't complete the sealing, something terrible would escape. But she had known she couldn't remain at St. Catherine's. She couldn't face the other sisters when they returned from their retreat. She couldn't tell them what had happened, couldn't explain where Mother Catherine and the others had gone, and she feared that whatever had been in that chamber might come looking for her, might know that she had been the one to trap it beneath stone and earth. So she had done something desperate and terrible. She had stolen Sister Agnes's identity. Sister Agnes had been alone in the monastery, recovering from her cold. She was the extern sister, the one with the most contact with the outside world, the one whose face was least known to the other members of the community because she spent so much time away. Sister Joan had known all of this. "I didn't mean to kill her," the old woman had said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I only meant to give her something to make her sleep, to keep her unconscious while I left. But I gave her too much. When I checked on her in the morning, she was dead. Heart failure," the autopsy later said, "caused by an overdose of the sleeping medication I had taken from the infirmary." Sister Joan had then done the unthinkable. She had dressed Sister Agnes in her own habit, had placed her in her own cell, and had arranged her as if she had died peacefully in her sleep. Then she had taken Sister Agnes's identity, had dressed in her clothes, had taken the monastery's truck, and driven to Montrose, as Sister Agnes had been scheduled to do. When she returned 3 days later, on December 31st, she was no longer Sister Joan Hartford. She was Sister Agnes Beaumont, the extern sister discovering that her 4 sisters had mysteriously vanished. She had called the police, had cooperated with the investigation, had maintained the deception for 36 years. "I couldn't tell the truth," she had said to Sarah. "I couldn't explain what had really happened. They would have thought me insane. And I was afraid that if I told them about the ritual, someone might try to open the chamber, might disturb the seal. I knew that seal had to hold. I knew what was underneath couldn't be allowed to escape." She had lived the rest of her life as Sister Agnes, eventually leaving religious life and living quietly, always watching the news for any mention of St. Catherine's, always fearing that someone would discover what lay beneath the chapel floor. Sarah had arrested her, of course. Despite her age and frailty, Sister Joan Hartford had committed murder, had concealed evidence, had obstructed justice. But Sarah had also recommended leniency, had included in her report the extraordinary circumstances, the trauma and fear that had driven a young woman to make impossible choices in an impossible situation. The district attorney had reviewed the case and decided not to prosecute, citing Sister Joan's age, her health, and the unique circumstances of the crime. She would spend her remaining days in the nursing home, no longer hiding behind a false name, finally able to tell the truth after more than 3 decades of silence. Now, as Sarah finished her report, she thought about all the layers of deception and truth that had been uncovered. 4 nuns had died trying to help what they believed were trapped souls, not knowing they were actually opening a doorway to something far more dangerous. One nun had sealed that doorway at the cost of her sisters' lives and her own identity, and countless others had lived and worked at St. Catherine's over the centuries, never knowing what lay beneath their feet, never understanding the true nature of the ground on which they prayed. The monastery would not be converted into a retreat center. The construction company had withdrawn from the project after the discoveries in the chapel, and the diocese had decided to leave the building abandoned. Father Donnelly had recommended that it be fully decommissioned, the grounds deconsecrated, the building eventually demolished. But the process would take years, perhaps decades, to work through the various bureaucratic and ecclesiastical channels. In the meantime, the site remained empty, guarded by a chain-link fence and warning signs. The chamber beneath the chapel remained sealed, protected now not just by stone and earth, but by official documentation, declaring it a closed investigation, a resolved case, a mystery finally solved. Sarah's phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Dr. Vasquez calling from New York. "Detective Bowen," the anthropologist said, her voice concerned. "I wanted to let you know that I've been monitoring some unusual seismic activity in the region around St. Catherine's. Nothing major, nothing that would be noticed by anyone not specifically looking for it. But there are vibrations, patterns that concern me." Sarah felt a familiar chill. What kind of patterns? The kind that suggests the seal might not be as permanent as we hoped. The kind that suggests something is still active beneath that chapel, still trying to find a way through. "What are you saying? That we need to go back? That we need to do the ritual again?" Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "I'm saying that thin places are thin for a reason. They exist at locations where the barrier between worlds is naturally weak, where the geology and the spiritual topology create conditions that can't be permanently changed. We closed the doorway, Detective, but we didn't eliminate the thin place itself. That will always be there, and it will always be a point of vulnerability. So what do? We monitor it. We watch for any signs that the seal is weakening, and if necessary, we perform the closing ritual again, and again, as many times as it takes to keep that doorway shut." Sarah leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. "For how long? Forever?" "Yes," Dr. Vasquez said simply. "For as long as that building stands and that ground remains accessible. Some things can't be solved, Detective. Some things can only be managed, contained, kept at bay. This is one of them." After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence, looking out her office window at the peaceful Vermont landscape. Somewhere out there, in the mountains to the north, St. Catherine's Monastery stood empty and quiet. Beneath its chapel floor, 4 women lay in their wooden tomb, their sacrifice and suffering now part of the public record, but their true purpose still misunderstood by most who would read about them. Sarah thought about Sister Joan Hartford, about the impossible choice she had made to seal her sisters in their grave, to steal another woman's identity, to live a lie for 36 years. She thought about Mother Catherine Devereux and her absolute faith that she was doing God's work, even as that work led her and 3 other women to their deaths. She thought about all the nuns who had lived at St. Catherine's over the centuries, praying and suffering and dying in that remote place, never fully understanding what they were guarding against. And she thought about what Dr. Vasquez had said, about how some things could only be managed, never truly solved. The case might be officially closed, but the reality beneath that closure was far more complex to us and far more disturbing. Sarah saved her report and prepared to submit it to the archives. The public would know that 4 nuns had died in a ritual gone wrong, that a 5th nun had concealed the deaths and lived under a false identity for decades. They would know the facts, the evidence, the official conclusions, but they would never know the whole truth. They would never know about the thin place, about the doorway between worlds, about the voices that still whispered beneath ancient stones. They would never know that St. Catherine's Monastery was not just the site of a tragedy, but a place where the boundary between reality and something else remained dangerously fragile. Some secrets Sarah had learned were too dangerous to share. Some truths were better left buried beneath stone and earth and silence, guarded by those few who understood their true nature and their terrible cost. She looked at the photograph on her desk, the one that had been taken of the four nuns during their final year of life, before they had discovered the old books and heard the voices that would lead them to their deaths. They looked peaceful in the photograph, serene in their habits, their faces reflecting a faith that seemed unshakable. Sarah wondered what they would think if they could see what their actions had led to, if they could know that their attempt at mercy had instead opened a doorway that would have to be guarded for generations. Would they have made different choices? Would they have left those ancient books undiscovered, those voices unanswered? She would never know. All she could do was finish her report, file the case, and trust that the seal would hold. Trust that Dr. Vasquez would continue monitoring. Trust that if the doorway began to open again, there would be someone there to close it. As night fell over Burlington and the lights came on in the office buildings around her, Sarah submitted her final report and closed the case file on her computer. The investigation into the disappearance of four nuns from St. Catherine's Monastery was officially concluded. But Sarah knew that the real work, the work of keeping that doorway closed, of maintaining the seal that Sister Joan Hartford had created with her sisters' bodies and her own terrible sacrifice, that work would continue for as long as St. Catherine's stood, and the thin place beneath it remained a vulnerability in the fabric of reality. Some mysteries, once solved, revealed truths more troubling than the original questions. This was one of them, and Sarah would carry that knowledge for the rest of her life, along with the responsibility of making sure that what had been sealed beneath that chapel floor remained sealed forever. Outside, the spring night was clear and bright with stars. But in the mountains to the north, darkness gathered around an abandoned monastery where four women had died, trying to save souls they thought were trapped, never knowing that what they were actually doing was opening a door that should have remained forever closed. And beneath the chapel floor, sealed beneath stone and earth and prayer, that door waited, always waiting, for the next person who might be foolish enough or faithful enough to try to open it again. 5 years later, Sarah Bowen stood at the edge of what had once been St. Catherine's Monastery. The building was gone now, demolished after years of bureaucratic wrangling and diocesan deliberation. All that remained was the foundation, partially filled with rubble and overgrown with vegetation. Nature was slowly reclaiming what had once been sacred ground. The chapel floor, however, remained intact. Father Donnelly and Dr. Vasquez had convinced the dioceses that this section should be preserved, though they had not explained exactly why. A small stone marker had been erected, bearing the names of the four nuns who had died there, and a simple inscription: "They gave their lives in service to what they believed. May they rest in peace." Sarah visited the site once a year, on the anniversary of the discovery. She came alone, bringing flowers that she placed on the marker, standing in silence for a few minutes before returning to her car and driving back to Burlington. Sister Joan Hartford had died 2 years ago, peacefully in her sleep, at the age of 93. In her final days, she had asked to see Sarah, had thanked her for understanding, for not judging too harshly the choices she had made, as a terrified young woman faced with the impossible. "Do you think they're at peace?" Sister Joan had asked, her voice barely a whisper. "My sisters, do you think they found the peace they were looking for?" Sarah had held her hand and lied kindly. "Yes, I think they're at peace." But the truth was more complicated. Dr. Vasquez continued to monitor the site, and while the seal had held, there were still occasional anomalies, small fluctuations in the electromagnetic field, unexplained temperature variations, and once a group of hikers who reported hearing singing coming from the abandoned foundation. Though no one was there, the thin place remained thin, the boundary remained fragile, and somewhere beneath the overgrown stones and the wild grass, 4 women lay in their wooden tomb, their hands bound with wire, their faces forever frozen in expressions of terror and awe. The doorway they had opened remained closed, held shut by stone and prayer and the sacrifice of the woman who had sealed it. But doorways, once discovered, were never truly forgotten. They existed in the space between worlds, waiting for someone to find them again, to turn the handle, to step through into whatever lay on the other side. Sarah placed her flowers on the marker and stood for a moment in the spring sunshine. Birds sang in the surrounding trees, and a gentle breeze rustled through the new leaves. It was a beautiful day, peaceful and bright, and it was almost possible to forget what lay beneath her feet. Almost, but not quite. She turned and walked back to her car, leaving St. Catherine's behind once more. In her pocket, she carried a small card with Dr. Vasquez's phone number, updated every year, always current, just in case the seal weakened, just in case the doorway began to open again. Some cases were never truly closed. Some mysteries were only ever temporarily solved, and some places remained dangerous long after the last prayers had been said and the last stones had fallen. St. Catherine's was one of them. And as long as Sarah lived, she would remember, she would watch, she would be ready. Because 4 nuns had died trying to open a doorway they didn't understand. 1 nun had died sealing it again. And that sacrifice had to mean something. It had to continue to protect the world from what lay beyond that thin place, from what whispered and waited in the spaces between worlds. The case file might be closed. The official investigation might be concluded. But the real work, the work of keeping that doorway sealed, would continue for as long as humans walked the earth and built their churches and monasteries on ground that had never been meant for such things. Sarah drove away, down the mountain road, back toward civilization and light and the ordinary concerns of everyday life. Behind her, the ruins of St. Catherine's faded into the forest, becoming one with the earth and stone and silence. But beneath it all, beneath the rubble and the roots and the sealed chamber floor, 4 women remained, forever vigilant, forever trapped, forever guarding the doorway they had accidentally opened in their quest for grace and mercy. Their names were remembered, their sacrifice was honored, but their true purpose, the real reason their deaths mattered, remained known only to a handful of people who understood that some secrets were too dangerous to share, and some truths were better left buried in the darkness where they belonged.